Okay, welcome back to episode 12 of the Bible Connection podcast. So guys, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So my name's Josh Williams, I'm your facilitator, and with me are my good friends John.
Hello.
Brandon.
Hey.
And Taylor.
Good afternoon.
So guys, this week we are discussing the entirety of the book of Judges. You guys ready?
I didn't prepare at all.
All right, let's rock and roll then. All right, first question. While reading the book of Joshua, we discussed how God had faithfully brought Israel out of slavery and into the land he promised Abraham. So why are they being captured and defeated by enemies in the land if they have already taken the land in the book of Joshua?
So I think this one's answered right in the text. Look at Judges chapter 2. It says, "Because this people have transgressed against my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not." So these other people's groups and the people that they're facing, they're there as a way to let the Israelites demonstrate their faith. If they're faithful, if they're not, and God is using them as a way to show where their heart is.
And this is a contrast as you're following along in the reading plan. You've from Genesis 1:28, and I harp on this, and I'll continue to harp on it until we finish this podcast. Genesis 1:28, it looms large in the text as we read along. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, have dominion, subdue the earth, and up till this point, it's been going pretty good, except for in Egypt. But as you get to Judges, it definitely you get to a roadblock here. It definitely slows down.
And this is a result of looking all the way back in Exodus chapter 34. It even warns the people, "You shall tear down their altars and break down their pillars and cut down their Asherim." That's the Asherah poles. "And you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land." So the exact thing they're warned about all the way back in Exodus is what they're doing there and then.
And I think it's not just Judges chapter 2, but you mentioned Genesis 1:28, where it says, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." Well, that's after he said he created man in his own image, in the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And then you go to Genesis chapter 2, and you see the way God created Adam and Eve in more detail. And I actually think that's what you're seeing structurally from the book of Judges is you have the first 3 chapters that talk about how they came into the land. Many of the tribes, like Manasseh and Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, they failed to take the land either because it was going to be difficult or out of fear. And then God says, well, because you did not take this land, they're going to be a thorn in your side. These other nations are going to be here to test you, and that your future generations might be tested by war. And when you go into the rest of the book of Judges, starting in chapter 4, you're going to see kind of that expanded. Every single judge we see throughout the narrative is explaining in a closer detail, in a chronological order, how the people of Israel went through this process of failing to take the land and being tested by God, by the nations within the land.
And I think it's important to remember, too, that this test, trusting the Lord in these circumstances in this land, is the hardest test that they will face. So when they're back in Sinai and they exited Egypt and they're out in the middle of the desert, they are brought a number of tests. If they are faithful to the Lord, God provided them bread, brought water from the rock, and they're tested a number of times. But in Deuteronomy 31, it says, "For when I brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and grown in fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them and despise me and break my covenant." So there were a bunch of tests before they get into the land of Canaan. And the tests when they're out in the desert, when it was 120 degrees by noon, there was just absolute terrible living conditions by our standards. Those tests were easier than the tests that they face in the land of Canaan, where it rains and crops are brought forth, and there's other people's groups that they're actually having to dwell and live alongside. That is a much harder test than when they're living out in the desert. And I think that's important to remember as we get into seeing where the heart of the Israelites are.
All right, moving on. So in the book of Judges, there are 12 different people, and they're called judges, right? So, real quick, I want you guys to explain to me, what is a judge, and why does God raise these people up for Israel?
Well, this is not actually a pretty obscure title or office compared to something that we understand today. When you hear judge, you really should be thinking a little bit of this person decides between a case of what's right and wrong for the land of Israel. And this is going to be a theme as you go through the text. Are the people going to decide for themselves rightly what the Lord would have them do, or are they going to do what's right in their own eyes? And these judges are people that God raises up, but they're not just, thinkers. They're not just guys in robes with wigs that have a gavel and make decisions for the people. They're also kind of like figures that are like heroes, meant to rise up and save the people when they've called out during their oppression. You see in Judges chapter 2, the Lord raised up judges, verse 16, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. And so you're going to see this pattern between every single judge where the people are going to sin. They're going to be oppressed by the nations as a test and a judgment for that sin. They're going to repent of that sin. They're going to be delivered by a judge. And then while the judge is judging over Israel, there will be peace. But when the judge leaves, they are left to decide for themselves. And we will see the result of that as we read through the book of Judges.
And as we look at each of the judges, we definitely need to see, and I may be jumping ahead here, we definitely need to see that each individual judge is representing Israel, especially when we get to Samson.
You're definitely jumping ahead. If we go into Samson, we haven't started the first judge.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the judges.
Okay.
All right, let's just move into let's talk about the first three judges. How about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off like that.
Well, all I wanted to see is was to show you it's clear. You can clearly see it in Samson.
Okay.
That Samson, we don't see anything about how big Samson's muscles are. We don't see anything about how tall Samson is. We don't see anything about Samson's physical stature. We see that when Samson it says the Spirit of the Lord descends on Samson and he does these mighty things. And from Samson's birth to Samson's the things in Samson's life points to Israel, right? Israel has a supernatural calling. They're constantly called. They're not mighty in number. They're not mighty in power, but they're mighty because the Spirit of the Lord has come upon them to do things. And so we see as we look at, and that's why I wanted to draw attention to Samson, so that we see the judges as pointing to, the judges are representing Israel. So now that being said, we can go back because I think we clearly see that in Samson. So going back, go ahead.
So
Gotcha.
before we go into the next one, from Othniel to Samson, as we look through the different judges, and we know that they are, through God, saving them from the hand of their enemies. Their enemies, the Philistines, a little bit of background. You'll see two gods or characters really often from Judges and really through the rest of the Tanakh, and that's Bale and Asherah. So a little bit of their background. There was this creator god named El. He had a mistress named Asherah, and Asherah was this fertility goddess, and they worshipped her for having children and so forth. And between them, within that mythology, had a son named Bale, and Bale means Lord. And Bale was the greatest and biggest and most mighty god of the Canaanite region. And Bale was known as the god of storms, the god of weather that brought thunder and lightning. Similarly, when you look at Zeus, the most mighty god of the Greeks, the one that had power over the storms and so forth. But Baal was that in the Canaanite culture. And you see the Israelites through each one of these circumstances with the different judges are struggling with worshiping Asherah and Baal. And it's not just what they are, but what they offer. So the Israelites, as you remember, they're living now in the land of milk and honey. And this land provides a lot of stuff that they like. Back in Egypt, when they wanted crops, the food and the agriculture was really ran by the Nile. It was not dependent upon rain. But here in Canaan, it was very important that the rain came at the right time. So the God of this region was providing rain, and therefore the God of that region was providing them with prosperity and through agriculture and the food and everything. So that's what the Philistines worshipped. They worshipped the God of weather to provide prosperity. And therefore, the Israelites living alongside this Philistine people and with them, instead of driving them out the way they're supposed to, start worshiping the same things that they do. And the judges that God sends to deliver them from this are pulling them from that idolatry. Now, when we look back at it, I think there's a strong correlation between us today and them. And it's important to make the pinpoints connections. We look back sometimes and say, okay, well, they're worshiping some god of weather, whatever. That means nothing. But really, what is Baal? Baal is a symbol of prosperity. And today in our culture, we as a society worship prosperity. The most wealthiest nation or country on the face of the planet is the United States. And you can see that there's a lot of idolatry in money. So really, by worshiping Baal, the heart of the issue is you're worshiping prosperity. The same thing that we really struggle with today. And you see the Israelites, and you'll see from Judges and on through the rest of the Tanakh that they are worshiping God alongside worshiping this God of prosperity. And we got to make sure that our hearts aren't worshiping God while at the same time worshiping prosperity, and draw that line and recognize that the sin then is really the same thing today. But just a little background, that's who Bale and Asherah were, and you're going to see these characters really throughout the rest of the Tanakh.
I love that correlation. I appreciate you bringing that up and drawing that into what we deal with today. But getting into our first three judges, so we see they are Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. So between these three guys, what can we learn about God from when they judged over Israel?
Well, as Brandon was saying earlier, I'm sorry for cutting you off again. These judges are meant to be types or pictures of Israel as you go through the text. And when you look at Othniel, the first judge that's raised up, he is the ideal picture of what these men in Israel are supposed to be. He is a faithful, brave man who steps it up when his father-in-law calls him to obedience and marries the daughter of Caleb. He conquers these Canaanite strongholds. And when the people were doing evil in the sight of the Lord, he basically judges between right and wrong for them. And when he dies, the people had rest for 40 years. We're not going to see another judge like Othniel in the rest of this text. For every single judge after him, you're going to see a decline, something that makes them a little bit lesser than the one before them. And what this is supposed to indicate to you is that the people of Israel, they have less and less men, that less and less figures that are ready to step it up and do what God has called them to do from the time of their fathers before them. So Ehud, we know him as left-handed. More literally in the text, it could be interpreted that he could not use his right hand. He's being underestimated by this king that's oppressing over Israel, and he comes in and he stabs him and sneaks out the window. Not necessarily as victorious and brave as the story that Othniel has, rising up when he's called on by Caleb. And then Shamgar, he doesn't have a sword. He doesn't have armor or an army. He takes what he has from the field. He has an ox goad, and he defends Israel from 600 Philistines with an ox poker, with an ox goad. And so you're seeing a decline, not morally yet, or even socially, but you're seeing a decline in their public standing, like how much political power these men have. And yet each of them are being raised up by God, and the Spirit is rushing on them so that they might judge and save Israel.
Anybody else got anything on the first three judges?
So there is one small thing I'd like to add is you'll notice the phrase with Othniel, chapter 3 verse 10, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. That language, we're very familiar with that language. It's in evangelicalism and Southern Baptist whatever culture. We're familiar with the language, but what does the language mean? Well, the language, if we're not careful, we will let our experience define what that language means. If you can, if I would challenge you to think about, where does this language, who is the first person to be spoken of to be filled with the Spirit, or this type of language? And I would draw your mind back to Exodus. And in Exodus, in chapter 36, Moses appoints a man named Bezalel to go out and to craft things for the temple, or for the tabernacle, I'm sorry. And it says that he is filled with the Spirit. So the first person who was filled with the Spirit was literally a blue-collar worker, right? And you think about, in the Judges, these judges were filled with the Spirit. What did the filling of the Spirit, what did they accomplish by being filled with the Spirit? And a lot of times we think about, we think about, charismatic stuff when we think about being filled with the Spirit and things like that. Well, being filled with the Spirit empowers us to be obedient to what God has called us to do, and not so much these miraculous things. I mean, there are miraculous things. I don't want to discount that, but the everyday mundane things of life, of living as a Christian, and raising up our families, and being faithful in the workforce, and being faithful to the local body of Christ, that takes being filled with the Spirit. And I think if we would read the scriptures carefully, we would see things like that. So
I think that's absolutely important, because when you look at what the judges are doing when they conquer these people throughout the land, this is what all of the men of Israel have been called to do in the book of Joshua. It's not some specific task that they've been waiting until a judge is told to do it. They're to do it now, today. They're supposed to go and take the land. So I love what you're taking us there with.
All right, moving on. We're gonna see the next couple judges. So we got Deborah and Gideon, and then we got this third guy. His name's Abimelech, and he's not even a judge at all. So what can we learn about God from when they judged over Israel? And who is this Abimelech that we see after their time?
Well, we see a further decline, this time not political power, but in terms of like social standing when we get to Deborah. The obvious difference between Deborah and the people before her, she's a woman. And it should beg the question, which some people do interpret this differently, and I want to make that clear. This isn't the only way to see it, but it kind of begs the question, well, where are the qualified men to go and take the land? Now, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that she's only a prophetess because there are no men. We could look back to Miriam and see that she was a prophetess at the same time as Moses, singing songs inspired by the Lord and teaching the people in the congregation. But you see right from the text that she takes Barak up and she says, haven't you been told? Have you not been told to go and take this land? And he says, well, I won't go unless you go with me. And she says, well, know for certain that you won't get the glory for this battle, but a woman will. And so I think what you're supposed to see when you see Deborah and then you see Gideon, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more, is that these people are in a decline of what you've expected from the earlier judges. There are less people that are inclined to obey the Lord and know his commandments. And so the Lord's raising up individuals that you wouldn't expect for the task. And so, Brandon, you wanted to mention a little bit about what happened with the general, Sair, or is that his name pronounced? I can't remember. And how Sisera, and how the young woman Jael defeated him.
In chapter 10, we see. You caught me off guard here. I was thinking about something else. But I was thinking about Deborah. But we see how that. In Genesis, we talked about a lot of themes that trace their way throughout Scripture, and one of those themes that we talked about was the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and how in the text we see that. Remind me of the verse here, because you threw me off.
Verse 21 is where she puts the tent peg through him.
Yeah, so. What
chapter 4?
Okay.
I can go ahead and read that for you.
Yeah, go ahead and read it. Sorry.
Yeah, so verse 21 says, but Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died.
Yeah. So in here, I would see that the Joshua is picking up on this theme that the seed of the woman is crushing the head of the serpent. So I would see that here.
Well, I think that one of the themes that we're supposed to draw from this too, as they're faithfully, carrying out that image of crushing the head of the serpent, like Deborah sings a song afterward, and what she says is, "My heart goes out," verse 9 of chapter 5, "my heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people." And she begins to sing the praises of those tribes that faithfully went into battle, and then she chastises those who were too cowardly to go. And so I think she's enforcing this theme that, like, where are the people in Israel that are supposed to be doing this this calling to take the land?
I think it's interesting too. So the people of Israel cried out for the Lord for help. They had 900 chariots of iron. That's a lot. And they were oppressed for 20 years. And I think the commander of the army, Sisera, is taken down by a woman. And I think there's significance within that culture too, that God is using her to accomplish this.
What do we got on I can't even speak. Was
as they say in Abimelech?
Abimelech, yes.
So we have this guy, Gideon, and Gideon, before the Lord comes in and saves the people in those days, he doesn't send Gideon at first. At first, the people say to the Lord that they are oppressed, and the Lord sends a prophet, not a judge, and he says to the people, I took you out of the land of Egypt, I delivered you from the Egyptians, I put you in the land, and then I drove out everyone before you. But you, right? You do not fear my name. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you did not obey my voice. And so once he sends this message, it's supposed to basically draw the inference together. Like, there's a reason why I'm not continually going to rescue you out of this sin. It's because you don't regret the actions that you're taking. You're regretting the consequences. And he calls this guy Gideon out, and Gideon is told that he is a mighty man of valor, but even he is acting cowardly. In the middle of the night, he's pulling down these altars and these false idols. And when he finally does receive victory, the Lord makes sure it's only his glory that's given. He dwindles the army down to 300 men, and they want to make him king. They want to make him king over Israel for his victory in battle. And at first he has the sense to say, "No, I'm not going to be king. The Lord shall rule over you." But then in the same breath, he's like, "But you can give me the gold and the spoils." And he creates this idol that he brings to his home that the text says becomes a huge snare to him. And then he starts marrying tons of women and having tons of concubines and basically acting like a king, even though with his lips he was saying, "No, don't make me king." He's taking contributions from the people. He's marrying all these women, like you're going to see Solomon and David do in the future. And one of the prostitutes that he had, one of the concubines, is going to basically take advantage of this and make a political play. She's going to name her son Abimelech. It says that she named her son, and that name means "my father is king." So she's contradicting what he said to the people. And Abimelech is going to kill his brothers in order to make an attempt to become king over Israel. And it's going to work for about 3 years. But in the end, he's going to be brought to a violent end. And we can see from the text that it's not just people that are acting, but this is the Lord that is enacting all of these things. In verse 22 of chapter 9, it says, "God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, so that the leaders of Shechem would deal treacherously." And at the end, after all the violence, after towers are burned, after people are killed, it says at the end of chapter 9, "Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father by killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham." And so what we're supposed to be seeing is that all these people, as they're acting out these sins, the Lord is using the oppression of the different nations and the actions of men in order to bring about consequences to them.
All right, next question. Let's roll into it. The next group of judges we see are either very obscure or just very rarely talked about. So we've got Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. That was tough. That was difficult for me. So who are these guys, and what can we learn from them? Not everybody wants.
I hate to keep being the one that chimes in, but you're not going to learn much about Elon, Abdon, Ibzan. There's not much in the text about them. I think you continue to see this narrative trend of how, it's not very glamorous. What do we know about them? They ride donkeys. What a hero, So it's not a very glamorous picture that you're getting. We do get a lot about this guy named Jephthah. And so Jephthah, he's supposed to be judging over the people of Israel, but he is a thug. He's been abandoned by his own household because he's the son of a prostitute. He hangs out with wicked men that use violence to get their means, and the people call on him to be their judge. And when he does, he knows so little about what God desires for the people. He's supposed to be deciding for the people, judging what's right and wrong. He knows so little that he even makes a vow that ends up having him sacrifice and burn his own daughter, which the Lord very clearly called an abominable practice that he detests in the book of Deuteronomy. But this man is so cowardly that he would have God judge him for making his vow and not keeping it, that he'd rather burn his daughter alive than face the Lord's judgment, which I think is a really intense indictment on what the status of the people of Israel are. They're called to teach their children diligently to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. Their greatest priority should be teaching their children to rise up and challenging them to obey the Lord. And the judge of Israel himself is such a coward that he'd rather, to preserve his own life and his own neck, burn his innocent daughter alive. And it's one of the most despicable things we've seen yet in the text, and we're going to actually see worse as we continue through the book of Judges.
Brandon Taylor, you guys got anything?
Why do you think? And this is very candid. Why do you think that he says the first thing that comes out the door? Do you think he had his daughter? And I mean, even though he says he laments that his daughter is.
I think he had a human sacrifice in mind, because if he had in mind an animal, which it would have been very strange for an animal to be living inside the tents, inside the houses of the people at this time. If he had in mind an animal, he would have just probably thought when his daughter walked out, well, that obviously doesn't apply. I think that he had in mind maybe one of his servants, and we've seen a total disregard throughout this text for any concubines, for any maidservants. Like these wicked men have zero respect for the rights and the well-being of young women in this text, and so I think he laments that it was his favorite, his daughter.
Does that mean a human sacrifice, or could that mean anything else?
I think it's a human sacrifice. It's not just. Some people have said that this is like maybe she's lamenting the fact that he's saying she'll never be married because she says, "Can I mourn my virginity?" But it wouldn't make sense. Can I do it for 2 months and then face the consequence if she's going to be a virgin for her entire life? So I think it means she's going to be killed.
And what he says at the beginning, it seems to imply to me that it's an offering that's going to be killed. Mm-hmm. But
it's an obscure situation.
It's very strange. It's very strange.
I don't know. I've always interpreted it as it was she remained a virgin, and the women would always weep over her virginity for her whole life. But I'm not saying I know the understanding of the text.
So let's make this a little bit even more awkward, because the book of Hebrews portrays Jephthah as a man of faith. Because if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, and he's gone through the patriarchs here, and then he moves on into verse 32. It says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received back their dead by resurrection." And it goes on to say a few more here, but probably referring to Isaiah later on. But so how do we this tension of even the judge of Jephthah being very foolish, this foolish vow, and not particularly, don't look at him as particularly, like a role model. But at the same time, the author of Hebrews tells us he was that 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 through faith they did this. How do we tie that together?
If they are figuring the people of Israel in that day, they're figuring the way that the Lord has raised up an individual in faith to obey his command to take the land. And so one thing we need to remember is that the book of Judges shows us the Bible's not a book of virtues or inspirational stories. The Bible is not about following good moral examples. It's about a God of mercy and long-suffering. He's continually at work despite our resistance to his purposes. And so I think from the text we can see God sovereignly acting in the hearts of men, and he is enabling these men to have the faith to rise up and do what's right despite their ignorance, their failure for generations to keep his word.
Yeah, and I think we should instead of saying, wow, these judges were a bunch of idiots, we should see ourselves in the judges. We should see that just like the judges, we have a high calling, but yet we mar ourselves in the pigsty more times than we care to remember or tell about. But it's easy for us to throw mud at the judges here, but we need to see ourselves in their place.
Yeah, and as we look at what he's actually doing, the whole human sacrifice thing, that is a Philistine practice.
Yeah.
And what they're doing are Philistine ways of life. So look at Judge number 1 and Judge number 12. It's becoming more and more Philistine each time.
And that being said, one of the reasons that God is going to drive out the inhabitants of the promised land is because of practices like that. God tells the children of Israel to purge the land of people like this, and yet Israel themselves are doing the things that the people that they're supposed to drive out, they're becoming like those people. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to branch off that a little more, let's take that idea, that concept, and apply it to today. Let's ask that question. How much are we to live in culture and be an influence to others versus how much are we to be influenced by the culture with our kids and our family and so forth? But due to lack of time, let's try to answer some of these other questions. But as I was mentioning, from Judges chapter 1, Judge number 1 to 12, we see a increasing Philistine way of lifestyle all the way till the time we get to Samson. And actually, I'll just let Josh go ahead and ask this next question.
Yeah, I'm rolling right into Samson, full steam ahead. So the book of Judges ends in a horrific display of disobedience, sin, and violence. So we got this final judge of Israel. His name's Samson. He ends up blinded and captured by Philistines. And then a group of Israelites gang rape and abuse a young girl until she dies. Where is God in all of this? And what good could possibly come from all of it?
Well, with Samson, the Lord was with him. And so that's a little hard to swallow because we like to think of Samson, I think of a children's song I was playing when I was leading Kids U as a bonehead, right? He's not really obeying the Lord. But for the first part of his life, he is. Samson is, yes, falling in love with a Philistine woman, and you might think that we should condemn him. But it says in verse 4 of chapter 14, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. And so Samson is conquering these Philistines. He's destroying their crops. He's attacking them at every chance he gets. And he does fall into a temptation with a Philistine prostitute and with Delilah. And I think you are supposed to see him as the least morally upstanding of all the judges, that he has. He's the final decline of these judges as we go through. But he did also obey in faith. Getting into the closing parts of what we see in Judges, if you ask the question, where is God? We were talking about this before the podcast. Brandon pointed out this phrase that's repeated 4 times. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And then sometimes partnered with that, it says, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I want to emphasize once again, this is not a collection of moral Bible stories that we're supposed to emulate. This is what happened in a historical moment. And the text answers, where's God in all of this? They're not obeying him. This is not what the Lord would have the people of Israel to do. This is wickedness and sin in the land. This is what it looks like when Israel basically becomes Sodom and Gomorrah itself. Because if they do not obey the voice of the Lord, and they do not meditate on his law, and they do not keep his commandments, the Lord is going to give them up into their sin, and they're going to become like the other nations.
So I think it's important too, looking at Samson, So he was to be set apart. But we recognize that he becomes like the Philistine people, and he is so Philistine by all the practices he does that he is no longer, he loses his strength when his hair is cut. If you look back to Numbers chapter 6, there's a Nazirite vow, and in that vow, the whole purpose of it was to be set apart, more specifically, more set apart from your culture. And the Nazirite vow, oversummarized, had three things: do not eat of the grapevine, no razor shall be put to your head, and you should not even go near a dead body. So we look at the life of Samson, and he's raised with this vow. He's supposed to live out according to what's listed out in number 6. But we see that he's actually early on found in the vineyards of Timnah. It's very likely that he would have been drinking wine at the wedding that he was at. A razor is put to his head after a sexual sin with Delilah, and he's found scraping honey out of the carcass of a lion. So he's touching a dead body. So he is breaking the Nazirite vow, and he's not upholding himself being set apart. And I think Samson is representative of the Israelite people. The Israelite people were to be set apart. They were called to be a kingdom of priests, the people that everyone else is to look to and see God and to live differently. But what happens with Israel is they end up living just like the Philistines. And archetypally, we can see that through Samson, kind of typologically a representative of the people of Israel, that he too is becoming Philistine. And we can see that in breaking the vow in the way that he lives, but there is redemption in him as we read.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is going back to in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's interesting that 4 times that the book of Judges ends that way. Well, a little preview into the next book in the way our canon is organized. Ruth is the next book. Well, we find that we come across a guy's name of Abimelech. Well, the book of Ruth tells us that this happens during the time of the Judges. Elimelech's name literally means God is king, right? So we see this glimmer of hope at the end. After there is no hope at the end of Judges, but as soon as we end Judges, there's no king in Israel. Picking up on, wait a minute, it seems like God is completely abandoned Israel, right? But God has not abandoned His promise, right? God's promise is He is going to conquer the world through this people, and through this time of sin and despair, He's still there. He's still there because we see the story of Ruth is going to redeem this story. So,
and I'm so excited to get through Ruth, but sadly, we've come to a close on the Judges. So, I want to say this real quick, audience. We love to get questions, so remember that you can share your questions with us. We have an email. It's thebibleconnectionbdbc@gmail.com, or you can simply leave a comment here on YouTube. And like I say every week, if you got our phone numbers, if you see us in church, or if you know somebody that knows us, just find us. We'd love to answer these questions, and we love the engagement. So, that's it for episode 12, and we'll see you on episode 13.